Okay. Hello and welcome to the second session of the Interfaith Coalition's, hold on. Great. The Interfaith Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence's 4-part series for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. This session will be recorded and emailed to everyone who registered for the series. Before I turn the discussion over to the moderator and IC member, Kerri Colfer, I want to introduce myself and the Interfaith Coalition. My name is Dorian Carr, and I'm the Senior Advocacy and Policy Manager at Jewish Women International. Today, I would like to acknowledge that I'm working from my home outside of Washington, D.C., a home which sits on the traditional land of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people, past and present. Acknowledging the land we each sit on is one way to continue honoring Indigenous peoples going forward, and I encourage other faith organizations and leaders to do the same. I am going to add in the chat the resource that I used to find that information. There, that is. JWI's focus and mission is to empower women and girls and end gender-based violence. We do this work in the secular, interfaith, and Jewish space. JWI first convened the Interfaith Coalition in 2007, and now it represents 40 faith-based organizations who come together to work to end violence against women and girls, with a focus mainly on impacting and effectuating change through federal legislative advocacy. This month, we're hosting this 4-part series that'll look at the intersection of race, religion, and domestic violence. Thank you for entering the space today, and I look forward to seeing you in subsequent sessions. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Kerri.
Thanks, Dorian, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Kerri Colfer. I'm Tlingit, which is a tribe in Southeast Alaska, and I am the Native Policy Lobbyist at the Friends Committee on National Legislation here in Washington, D.C. Our legislative priority is addressing the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women through bills like the Violence Against Women Act, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. As most of you know, Indigenous Peoples Day was just 2 days ago, and we are now right in the middle of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I think right now is the perfect time to speak about this epidemic of violence against Native women. We have a really great panel today. So we are joined by Tami Truett Jerue, a citizen of the Anvik tribe, Daguetan Athabascan tribe from interior Alaska. Tami is the executive director of the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, and she's worked in this field of domestic violence and sexual assault for the last 40 years. The Alaska Native Women's Resource Center is dedicated to strengthening local tribal governments' responses through community organizing efforts, advocating for the safety of women and children in their communities and homes. So next we have Liz Carr, a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, who serves as the Senior Native Affairs Advisor for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, or NIWRC. NIWRC is a Native-led nonprofit organization dedicated to ending violence against Native women and children. NIWRC provides national leadership in ending gender-based violence in tribal communities by lifting up the collective voices of grassroots advocates and offering culturally grounded resources, technical assistance and training, and policy development to strengthen tribal sovereignty. And finally, we have Kelbie Kennedy. Kelbie is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma that comes to us from Buffalo Valley, Oklahoma. Kelbie works in Washington, D.C. as a policy counsel for the National Congress of American Indians, or NCAI. NCAI was established in 1944 by tribal leaders in response to the termination and assimilation policies the U.S. government forced upon tribal nations in contradiction of their treaty rights and status as sovereign nations. To this day, protecting these inherent and legal rights remains the primary focus of NCAI. Kelbie spearheads NCAI's work on violence against Native women, as well as public safety and justice. So thank you all so much for being here with us today. Before we get started with our panel, I do want to start off with some statistics about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And just keep in mind that we will be discussing topics like sexual assault and gender-based violence. So I want to give that warning before we begin. So as you can see on the slide Dorian put up, more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. So that's 84.3%. Native women also face murder rates more than 10 times the national average in some communities. 96% of Native women who are victims of sexual violence experience that violence at the hands of a non-Native person. And US attorneys decline to prosecute more than half of violent crimes that occur in 67% of those sexual abuse related cases. So as you can see, not only are the victimization rates extremely high for Native women, but the likelihood that they will see justice is also very low. And that is often due to these jurisdictional gaps that exist that prevent tribes from prosecuting these non-Native perpetrators. And so with that, I'd like to move on to some of the questions for our panelists. I'll ask some questions and then we will move into questions from the audience. So we encourage you to put those questions into the Q&A section. So my first question for everyone is, why do we see such high rates of violence against Native women? I don't know, Kelbie, do you want to start off?
Sure, and thank you so much, Kerri, and thank you so much to everybody for taking some time out of your afternoon to learn about this really important subject, especially for all the Native women on this particular panel, but Native women all over Indian country. Violence against Native women, as you noted, Kerri, is incredibly high, and there are a variety of reasons that is. You've already alluded to one of the biggest reasons, which is the jurisdictional gaps that happen in Indian country right now. There is a long history of the United States government dispossessing tribal nations and tribal citizens of their rights, and one of those rights is to prosecute people who are within their jurisdictions that commit crimes. And what that does when we see gaps of tribal jurisdiction is it allows non-Indian perpetrators the ability and the knowledge to know that they are not going to be prosecuted for these cases, right? There's a saying back home that hunters know where to hunt and predators know where to prey, and non-Indians know that, the tribe doesn't have the ability to actually prosecute if I hit my wife or, my partner. And the federal government is, even if they do bring the case, the FBI or the federal government isn't actually going to prosecute this case. And so it creates this vacuum where non-Native people have the ability to commit these crimes against Native women and essentially get away with it. There are a lot of also social and other issues that contribute to violence against women, and I'll briefly just mention one and then turn it over to my friends on the panel. But there's a severe lack of resources for victims and survivors in Indian country. There are less than 60 tribal domestic violence shelters throughout the United States, and there are 574 tribal nations. And so when women and Native people in particular need to have a place to go to be safe, and I can speak from this from personal experience, from seeing family members in my own community, if there is no tribal shelter, there's no place for people to actually go, and so they can't get out of these situations. So now you have, a judicial system, a law enforcement situation where there's going to be no justice served. There's no way for, there's no place for the person, the Native woman, to be able to get out with her kids sometime, to be able to find safe shelter, and so she has to stay in with the perpetrator a lot of times. So I just wanted to briefly mention there's a jurisdictional component, there's a resource component, but there are a large variety of issues that contribute to these high rates of violence against Native women today.
Yeah, I think also it's important to mention from a historical perspective that this crisis isn't new and that it has deep roots in the historical mistreatment of Native people, particularly Native women. In the history of the United States, colonization introduced the idea of gender-based violence into our communities. And looking back, we know that colonizing tactics directly targeted Native women leaders in our community, because by attacking the identity of Native women, they're attacking the identity of our very societies and the very foundation of our communities as well. I think that, in addition to what Kelbie had mentioned, I think colonization and the resulting historical trauma is one of the main reasons that we still see an epidemic of violence against Native women. So I think just from a historical perspective, it's really important to remember where we came from and how we got to where we are, while also acknowledging that the ill-advised federal policies are still impacting the way we respond to violence in our communities. So I just wanted to mention that.
And I agree with both of the other panelists, but I think that there's some other factors that we haven't taken into consideration. And depending on where you are located in terms of the community that you live in 575 tribal communities in the nation, 229 of those tribes exist in Alaska. And in those 229 tribes that exist in Alaska, of course, those tribes are mostly in isolated areas. And isolation means there's no roads to those tribes. There's no access except through boats or planes or whatever the type or mode of transportation might be. That being said, I don't want to minimize the fact that also, just because of the different policies in place, we call it the lower 48, but the lower 48 tribes also have, many of those tribes are also in isolated areas that are only accessible they are accessible by roads, but they're not protected in a way that they can be patrolled. And that's a key component when we start talking about these types of protections. First, you have already laid in place the attitudes, generational attitudes of, and I'm going to just say the word racism, but that racism goes a step longer and further. And that is that women are not considered necessary to really try to, you don't need to protect them. Even though in tribal and traditional culture, protecting women was one of the major honors that happened, or one of the major things that was important, because they're the life givers. And as life givers, they were also the main group of people that needed to be attacked, because if you want to bring a group of people to the ground, you're going to attack the women. But the problem with that is that you may say, well, historically, we're in the 20th century or 21st century. And the fact is, why is that still happening? Because that has been an underlying both political and moral issue. And I think that we can't take away the whole idea of a moral issue. And the fact is, there's a lot of rumor, there's a lot of other things that have impacted the attack. And I say that really, I don't say that lightly, the attack on Native women in terms of sexually and in every other way, because this is what continues to keep our tribal communities in their weakest link, basically. In Alaska in particular, we talk about jurisdiction, we talk about law enforcement, we talk about prosecution. Many of times those things don't exist. Most Alaska Native communities don't have law enforcement. At least 40% of those communities don't have law enforcement because of laws like Public Law 280 and things like that. Those policies impact the way that they can even have any kind of prosecution, if prosecution exists. So oftentimes the attitude is, it's almost like the Wild West. I've heard it described as the Wild West, whereas you could just have a shootout in the middle of the street and nothing's going to happen. It's very similar to that in many of our tribal communities. And that may be a little graphic, but that's and I'll say more about that, but thank you.
Thank you so much. And, it's so important to talk about all of these different aspects that go into, that are the reason for this violence. And so I really sort of want to move on and talk about the lack of justice that we're seeing as well. And so I'll ask this question to you, Kelbie. Why is tribal jurisdiction over non-Native perpetrators so important for this issue?
Thank you so much, Kerri. And it can't be overstated how important it is. It is important because it assures accountability for holding non-Natives accountable when they attack Native women, Native children on tribal land, and assuring the safety of Native women both implicitly and explicitly. As I said a moment ago, there are a lot of jurisdictional gaps where tribes can't prosecute non-Natives when they attack Native women on tribal land. And what that does is create this jurisdictional vacuum where the tribe actually can't prosecute. Even if you have a tribal law enforcement officer, you have tribal courts, you have tribal prosecutors, if the tribe doesn't have jurisdiction, and what that means is the tribe's ability to have control over the body of the person that they're prosecuting, the ability to prosecute, then because the federal government has failed on their trust and treaty responsibility to protect Native people, they're supposed to be stepping up in this space, and they're not stepping up in this space. And so what we need is to be able to have the tribe, reaffirmed in their ability to prosecute people who come into their lands, who, attack their citizens in their, in their homes, in a variety of different ways to be able to take those people to court. Living here in Washington, D.C., I've lived a lot of places. I grew up on my tribe's reservation back in Oklahoma. I've lived in the Federated States of Micronesia. I've lived in a lot of places across Indian country. And I can say, having lived in places where if I call the police, they can show up right away. I know that, at least somebody will show up and help me versus living in a place where, there is no law enforcement, right? Or if there is law enforcement, they can't do anything to actually help me. And it's a scary place to live. And so assuring that tribes have the inherent power that tribal nations have always had, that they were dispossessed in the Oliphant decision, making sure that Congress lives up to its treaty and trust responsibilities, reaffirming tribal jurisdiction so that non-Indian perpetrators can be held accountable when they commit a wrong on tribal land, and also assuring that myself and other Native women can both have the knowledge that if something happens to me, at least my tribal government can help bring justice. And it also sends a message to non-Indians saying, hey, if you're going to do something bad here, you can't just rely on the tribe not being able to prosecute. You can't, just rely on the federal government to just say, well, this is too small of a fish. This is too small of a case. I don't want to take it. And to Kerri's statistics earlier, it's really hard for victims in domestic violence and sexual assault cases to bring their cases forward anyway. And for over half of the cases to be, not prosecuted by the federal government, and for even more of those cases to all be DVSA cases, it's fairly shocking. So this is a huge issue in Indian country, and giving tribal nations or reaffirming tribal nations jurisdiction over non-Indians assures that Native women and their bodies and their children and Native peoples are protected by the government. And it's really a focus about community control, right? Making sure that tribal nations can govern themselves, that they can provide the protections for their own people, because once again, the federal government has failed on their treaty and trust responsibility to ensure safety for Native people. And so I'll pause and see if there's anything else to add to that.
Thank you so much, Kelbie. So I want to ask Liz about what current initiatives do exist to address and stop this violence.
Sure. Well, I'm going to focus primarily on the grassroots level because there's just so much going on across the spectrum, right? Like from raising awareness on the national level to advocating for policy change on the federal level to simply implementing programming in our communities and returning traditional practices to addressing violence in our communities. So, but from the grassroots level, the beliefs of Indigenous nations held women as sacred and respected them as a cultural foundation of relationships. These beliefs were natural protections and community safeguards for women within our nations. And the introduction of violence against Native women was part of the colonization of our nations. So the very laws and policies of the United States have endangered Native women and eroded these social protections for our women. So I think primarily what the focus is of the grassroots is really to return to that inherent tribal authority back to tribal nations to be able to protect their women, specifically to their cultural teachings. And I think it's important to note that this is one way that tribes are working to address and prevent violence in their communities. Oftentimes, unfortunately, federal grant programs limit project purposes and services that can be offered, but we know that tribal-based services are essential for Native women. These services often are not needed for one time, but are essential as ongoing support as the woman continues her healing journey. And really to be meaningful, these services must reflect the beliefs of the woman to be served. So in addition to pushing for enhanced jurisdiction and other policy changes, the grassroots are really working hard to return to more tribally, traditionally based victim services for healing. And while we advocate, we as advocates continue to push for important legislation on the Hill, it's really important for us and our allies to remember that tribes really do know how best to address situations in their communities, and that we want to be able to include that kind of perspective in any legislative change that moves forward, including in the design and implementation of federally funded programs. So I think that's really kind of what I wanted to hit on in terms of the grassroots level and the work that's being done. But of course, like I said, so much is going on. And for the folks on the call who want to be allies, a lot of things to push and promote in terms of awareness, but also to do some education in your communities as well.
Thanks, Liz, for that perspective about grassroots, and as well as understanding culturally appropriate treatment and healing for tribes. Could you give us a little bit of information about the 2013 VAWA reauthorization, the tribal title, and what it did for tribes?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So VAWA 2013 was historic from a tribal perspective in that it restored inherent tribal authority of Indian tribes to prosecute non-native defendants for certain crimes in what we call a partial Oliphant fix, also known as special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction. Unfortunately, it is a little bit limited in scope and left some loopholes, leaving Native women unprotected from non-Indian perpetrators. And those loopholes really come from the fact that special criminal jurisdiction only pertains to domestic violence, dating violence, and violations of a protection order. And there are other crimes that occur that really impact Native women that just are not covered by special criminal jurisdiction. Another situation that makes it a little bit limited is that the defendant must have close ties to Indian country, which means they must reside in the Indian country of the tribe, be employed in the Indian country of the tribe, or be a spouse, intimate partner, or dating partner of a tribal member or non-member Indian who resides in the Indian country of the tribe. So this limited scope and the loopholes that are kind of created by the limited scope make it really still quite difficult to prosecute non-Indian defendants. Another major issue that we continue to work to address is that special criminal domestic violence jurisdiction is titled to Indian country, right? Which actually results in 228 of the 229 Alaska Native tribes being left out of these provisions. So there's just a lot that was left out, and it wasn't on purpose. It was just, oversight and whatnot. So things that we're continuing to work on as we move forward with the reauthorization.
Thanks, Liz. I think it's really important to understand how restrictive some of those provisions can be, even though maybe on its face, it appears to be a really great thing. And it was an important step forward. But I'm wondering if Kelbie can talk about what we actually need in a new VAWA reauthorization. By we, I mean tribes and Native people.
Absolutely, Kerri. So, over the last 7 years, tribal nations have had a good amount of time to kind of really identify a variety of gaps that are existing right now in jurisdiction. Liz already mentioned some key gaps in jurisdiction. Obviously, all of our Alaska Native villages need to make sure that they have the ability to prosecute not only the crimes that were included in VAWA 2013, but also, additional crimes that tribal nations have identified as being gaps in the prosecution process. Also assuring that other tribal nations that were left out, like tribes in Maine, for example, are included to make sure that they actually have the ability, once again, to prosecute crimes from 2013 VAWA and additional crimes. So what are those additional crimes that I keep alluding to that tribal nations have identified as we need to close these gaps in the next round of reauthorization? So the first set of those crimes are crimes against children. So it's hard to imagine that when a tribal nation actually is able to prosecute a non-Indian for domestic violence, perhaps they're married to that particular Native person, and if they abuse the child, however, the tribe can prosecute for the domestic violence case against the mother, for example. They cannot prosecute for the child abuse. And that is just hard to comprehend, but that is the reality of what a variety of situations have created in Indian country. So you want to make sure that we close the loop on child abuse in Indian country and assure that all Native children that are involved in these particular situations have the safety and protection, just like Native women will, of their tribal nation being able to protect them, to prosecute their perpetrators, and bring them to justice. The second crime that we really want to highlight and make sure that the gap is closed is crimes against tribal law enforcement. So it's not just tribal police officers, even though we know that domestic violence cases are often some of the most dangerous cases that police officers come into. The current situation in Indian country today is if a tribal police officer comes to a domestic violence situation and that non-Native person injures the police officer, they stab them, they do something to the police officer when they're trying, to resolve the situation, you can't prosecute the non-Native for attacking the tribal police officer. And that leaves a lot of openings for those particular perpetrators to still not only attack Native women, but attack the justice system. It also includes people like your tribal bailiffs, other people within the tribal judicial process. We just want to make sure that, you know, non-natives that are going to be put through the tribal judicial process, when they attack, right, when they attack a bailiff in the middle of a court proceeding, that you can actually prosecute that non-native person for attacking your tribal bailiff in the middle of a court proceeding. So that's the second round of crimes. Another kind of a different area of crimes are crimes that Liz alluded to, where, you know, you don't have as many ties to Indian country. So we want to make sure that we cover those crimes as well. Those crimes are sexual assault, trafficking, and stalking crimes as well. So while there is a need essentially to have complete tribal jurisdiction over all non-Indians, you know, that perpetrate these crimes within Indian country, but these are the particular gaps, those tribally specific, making sure that all tribal nations have the ability to prosecute these types of crimes, but also expanding the jurisdictional radius to assure that the gaps that tribal nations have seen over the last 7 years are truly filled as we continue to push forward and make sure that Native women and children and Native peoples are safe inside of Indian country wherever they live.
Thank you so much, Kelbie. So I see, you know, one of the questions we have here is about Savannas Act. So we recently saw, for anyone who doesn't know, we recently saw Savannas Act and the Not Invisible Act pass. They were actually signed into law this past Saturday. So Liz, could you explain a little bit about those bills and why they're important?
Yeah, absolutely. We're really excited that the crisis of MMIW, missing and murdered Indigenous women, is finally being acknowledged in Congress, and that steps are actually being taken to address it. So like I mentioned, both Savannas and Not Invisible focus primarily on the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis, and not so much the jurisdictional challenges or victim services resources that we've discussed thus far. Really though, the passage of Savannas and Not Invisible really mark an important first step in answering the calls of Native families, advocates, and tribes in addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis. It's a really important first step for the federal government to uphold its trust responsibility to assist tribal nations in safeguarding the lives of Native women and children. And we're really excited because it's an important part of addressing the spectrum of violence that Native women face. These bills really aim to improve data access and data collection, as well as establish protocols to address missing and murdered Native people, and improving the federal tribal coordination to combat the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. In terms of domestic violence, we know that, you know, domestic violence and MMIW are really tied together as a part of the spectrum of violence that Native women face. And we acknowledge that these bills are an important first step, but that much work still needs to be done to address all types of violence experienced by Native women. So like we've mentioned earlier, we continue to push for the expansion of jurisdiction, also, you know, enhanced and increased victim services resources. But we're very thankful for Savannas and Not Invisible, and we really look forward to working with, you know, the federal government to implement these important bills. And so I think that's all I have, unless you want me to go specifically through, you know, what they actually, you know, aim to do.
I mean, I think that would be great if you could.
Sure. So yeah, so Savannas really aims to improve the response of MMIW by improving tribal access to federal criminal information databases. It also will require data collection on missing and murdered Native people, which we would think already exists, but unfortunately it doesn't. So we're excited about that. It also directs the U.S. attorneys to develop law enforcement and justice protocols to address missing persons. And again, it's something you would think would exist, but unfortunately, because of the jurisdictional challenges and all of the crisscrossing in jurisdiction is really just a big challenge. So this will be a really good opportunity to kind of streamline that process and really develop a protocol for the first time. The Not Invisible Act is really aiming to improve coordination of the federal government by establishing an advisory committee of local, tribal, and federal stakeholders, really to make recommendations to the Department of Interior and Department of Justice on best practices to combat the epidemic of disappearances, homicide, and violent crime committed against American Indian and Alaska Natives. So again, we're really excited for both of these bills to actually be implemented, and some ground to be made up in terms of the work and coordination on the federal government level.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I think, for these two bills to pass in the middle of a pandemic really shows how important this crisis is and that it's urgent and we're still dealing with it and something needs to be done now. So thanks for explaining a little bit more about those bills, Liz. Before we head into more questions from the audience, I have a final question for all three of you, which is what can non-Native people do? What can faith communities do to help with this crisis of violence in Indian country?
I can start. I think the biggest thing is to use your platforms to raise awareness of the issues with your friends, your families, and your faith communities. It's really important to elevate the issues so that more people simply just care. I think one of the most important things individuals can do is to also let your member of Congress and senator know that tribal issues, not just Native women's issues, but tribal issues are important to you as a constituent. While our voices are strong as Native people, we are really just a small portion of the population, and we really need our allies to care about Native issues in terms of the way their members of Congress and senators, act on certain legislation. So recognizing that a lot of times tribal issues are, because it's not a priority issue for them, the last thing that a member of Congress might think of, being reminded by a constituent that you care, helps the issue along and helps focus some of their important time on really important issues that they just may not be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. I'll quickly add, Kerri, that just to build off of what Liz has put down, in particular in the area of violence against Native women, I think her advice is completely spot on letting your legislators know that you care about these issues, that these issues are important to you, and allies are really important to making sure, are really instrumental, quite honestly, in making sure that Native women are protected in these spaces by continuing to make these phone calls, letting them know how important it is. Specifically in the area of violence against women, I just want to let people know that the jurisdictional gaps that I spoke about a minute ago are covered in a couple of pieces of legislation that are in Congress right now. So earlier this year, the House actually passed the Violence Against Women bill, HR 1585, and that included all of the jurisdictional gap covers that I talked about. The Senate has a bill that's currently open, still hasn't gone up for a vote, but that bill is S843. And that particular bill, it also includes reauthorization of VAWA, but it also includes all of the tribal gap fillers as well. Another thing tribal advocates have done in this space are to not only talk about, these are the gap fillers we need to have in VAWA, we've also specifically gone out and put together marker bills to help legislators see, look, these issues about tribal jurisdiction and filling these gaps, these are not controversial issues. You can, there are some issues that people have issues with in terms of what is going into VAWA, but the Indian country provisions are not things that people disagree over. So there's a bill called the Native Youth and Tribal Officer Protection Act. That bill in the Senate is S290, and on the House side it's HR 958. That is a marker bill that specifically looks at giving tribal nations jurisdiction or reaffirming tribal nations jurisdiction over child abuse crimes and crimes against tribal law enforcement. We have a lot of bipartisan support for that marker bill, once again, to highlight that this is not a controversial issue. So when negotiations are happening over VAWA, it helps strengthen our position to say this is not something that needs to leave this bill because people on both sides of the aisle agree that this needs to be within VAWA going forward. Another marker bill that we have out there is the Justice for Native Survivors of Sexual Violence Act. S288 and HR 3977. That's the particular bill that looks at trafficking, sexual assault, and a couple of other gaps that I mentioned earlier as well. So both of those bills have bipartisan support, but we want to make sure that that bipartisan support continues to grow. And so we will continue implementing the strategy of making sure that all of the tribal provisions are within VAWA reauthorization bills, but also highlighting that there are standalone bills that help bring people together, especially when they come to the negotiating table, to highlight that Native issues are important. I also think that it's important to for faith leaders to bring Native voices to the table. And so I appreciate those that have helped make this webinar happen today. It's really important to hear directly from Native people on these issues, assuring that they have a seat at the table and allowing them to speak about their own issues. And then when we're not in the room, as Liz said, making sure to be a good ally, letting people know that you care about this issue, that it is important to you, and we definitely thank you for that if you're looking at doing that. And then also, thank you so much for coming out and spending some time with us today. I think part of the first steps are becoming educated on the issue, and then you can be a bigger advocate on it. And so this webinar is definitely one of those earlier steps. And then finally, I would say, in terms of grassroots organizing, working with your local tribal nation, just like there was a land acknowledgement at the beginning of today's webinar, every single person in the United States is standing on Native land right now. If you're in the United States, there were Native people where you were at. Sometimes tribes have been moved away from their traditional homelands, like my tribe, the Choctaw Nation, was moved on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. But sometimes tribal nations were not moved up to their homelands, or there are tribal nations that were moved near to where you are. I think working with your local tribal nation and seeing, how you can be a better ally on both the grassroots level and also the national policy levels would go a long way. And developing those relationships with your local tribal nation could also help move the needle forward, both, as I said, on a policy level, overarching overall, but also helping on the grassroots level with Native people in your own community. So I'll pause there and turn it over to Tami.
Well, and I, of course, agree with my sisters here on the panel about all of the policy work and at the 3,000-foot level that we need to be working. But we have to come back down to the grassroots level. And I think that we all personally, and this is my opinion, of course, need to understand our biases. And by understanding our biases, we are able to then understand potentially the issues that we are faced with. There are many, many groups of people who need our attention, that need policies to be changed and laws to be changed. But ultimately, when you have the first peoples of this country who have been basically victimized, and also I'm not a very, I think victimization is a concerning word, but have survived the many, many challenges that have been placed before them because of the resources of this land. I think we have to understand what the biases are. And understanding biases really then understands what the victimization looks like. And unfortunately, we are still suffering at the highest rates of victimization in most of those areas. But again, the resiliency and their survivorship of our people is amazing. And I think that we also have to remember that. So I think that if nothing else, if we take nothing else from this, we have to understand our biases. And what does that look like? And if you are interested, because not everybody is, and that's okay too. But if you are interested, is to try to look and learn and potentially change what that might look like for you all or your faith community, and or then if you can help with some of this higher level policy work, and or even the local advocacy type of work or grassroots level work, or just understanding what the need might be at that, in that forum. I think that is what where the value lies. So I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the panel. And of course, I'm always privileged to be on the panel with such wonderful people. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I just want to say that, even if you live in an area or a city where you feel Native people are not very visible, or you live in a state where there aren't any federal or state recognized tribes, that doesn't mean that Native people are not there. They very much are, I promise you. And so speaking to your members of Congress is still really, really important, and you can really make a difference. And let them know that this is something you care about, because then they have to care about it. And so, we need more people to raise these issues, no matter where you are. And so Kelbie, you're getting a lot of interest from the chat about some of the bills that you mentioned. And so we'll make sure to send out information on that so everyone can look into them and support them. So one of the questions that I have is, can we talk more about why 220, so why 227, 228 tribes, or 228, but of 229 tribes in Alaska were left out in 2013? Can we talk a little bit more about, those definitions and Indian country and all of that? I think that confuses a lot of people and probably shocks a lot of people that almost half of the federally recognized tribes in the United States are often left out of this legislation.
Well, I'm going to take a stab at that, just because I'm probably not the only attorney on. I always like to joke that I'm not an attorney, but I hang out with a whole lot of really wonderful attorneys that have taught me a lot. Well, there's a interesting little case. Well, there's several policy things that happened in Alaska. Alaska is a large state, as you know. We do have 229 very distinct tribes. We have several different regions represented, and a lot of those regions are separated into almost like language groups. That was what the shared groups were: the Inupiaq, the Yupik, the Tlingit Haida, Tsimshian, the Aleut, Alutiiq, Athabascan, and there's different groups within those groups that also exist. That being said, there were several bills, and it was about land early on in the 70s, Inilka, Angska. And what it did is that it basically traded land for the tribal jurisdiction. And this is oversimplified, and it's not explaining it well, but we only have a short time. And the reason I say it like that is because then federal recognition of those tribes was taken away in the 70s during those particular trades of land, money. And what it was is oil was discovered in Alaska. So there was a whole lot of negotiations, as you can imagine, going on. But that wasn't the most critical piece. They were still considered, they still owned the land. There was still land owned by tribes, even though there wasn't federal recognition of tribes. In the early 90s, during the Clinton administration, under Janet Reno, the tribes in Alaska were re-recognized. And so it went from 300 and some odd federally recognized tribes to 567 at that time federally recognized tribes, because they added back the 229 tribes. Well, again, Alaska had some really unique, interesting land deals that had happened over that 25 years and even further back than that, particularly since they became a state in 1959. And then they were also put into a Public Law 280 state initially in statehood. They never were not a Public Law 280 state, which is a whole nother conversation. But in the mid 90s, there was a case called the Venati decision. And the Venati, and it's called Venati, but the Venati decision was a group, it was a Gwich'in Athabascan community that wanted to tax a company that was coming in to do some work on their land. Well, this company didn't want to be taxed, and they said that there was no tribal jurisdiction. Well, there's a lot of backstory about that. But in consequence to that is they lost that, and they took away all tribal jurisdiction designation except for Metlakatla. And that was because of a different land deal that had been made in the late 1800s in the village of Metlakatla. And so that's a very oversimplified reason that basically Alaska tribes do not own the land, that they don't have jurisdiction on the land that they live on. They have jurisdiction over their citizens. And so they don't have what they call Indian country, which is one of the, again, it's a whole nother story, but I hope that was a simplified way of explaining it.
Thank you, Tami.
Kerri, if I could.
Yeah,
sorry.
Jump in, Kelbie.
I only have one bullet point to add to Tami's really great explanation, because I always feel like I've learned so much from her every time we speak at the same event. Indian country in and of itself can be a variety of different types of land. So this could be tribal trust land, so it's land that the tribe outright owns. So for example, my tribe owns land that we have our tribal administrative building on, right? That is called Indian country. There's also individual lottee land. So when tribal reservations were divided up, my family, for example, got an allotment. That also counts as Indian country. But then there's also tribal reservation land. So let's talk for 3 seconds about a decision that came out of the Supreme Court very short, not that long ago, which is the McGirt decision. That particular decision reaffirmed the reservation boundaries for the Muskogee Creek Nation. It didn't change the type of land within those counties in Oklahoma. No one lost land, no one gained land. The tribe didn't suddenly own everybody's land. What that did was it reaffirmed the boundaries that the tribe had when they came into Oklahoma to say the tribe now has jurisdiction over all these different types of land. And what that does is when you have a domestic violence case under VAWA, that means that when you have a domestic violence case, and I'll just use an example. When you have a domestic violence case that happened on an allotment before McGirt in that area, it would fall under VAWA and the tribe would have the ability to prosecute the non-Indian. After McGirt, you can have a domestic violence case happen on fee land, so it's not tribal land, and that means that that case now falls under VAWA. So Indian country in and of itself counts for a variety of different lands the tribe owns, lands an individual Indian owns that's in trust, or inside of a tribal reservation. So I just wanted to add that quick bullet point and highlight the reaffirmed status of Indian country in Oklahoma for people.
Well, and very briefly, let me add a little bit of a caveat to that. So that's really, that's a great explanation because there is different lots of lands. And in Alaska, there is allotment land. There's small pieces of land that, like for instance, Tlingit Haida owns a piece of land that their building stands on that's Indian country, and land into trust. But Alaska has not had the same ability to put land into trust as other states or other pieces of Indian country. Again, it was a political move by some of our esteemed legislators over the years that basically was an informal memo to BIA that stated that we weren't going to do land into trust in Alaska. Again, very big political things that we don't need to get into here, but that was also something that now has been reversed, and now tribes in Alaska are really working towards trying to establish land into trust in several pieces of their country.
Thank you so much for that. And I know this can be really confusing to people who don't, deal with these issues very often. And, Kelbie mentioning the McGirt decision really shows how important VAWA is, the Violence Against Women Act is for tribes. This issue is so important for tribes throughout the United States. And so I want to pivot a little bit and just talk about COVID-19 and its impact on tribes and victim services and domestic violence and sexual violence in tribes.
I'll go ahead and start. From our perspective, we've heard all kinds of different stories from our advocates in the field. Some are, some tribes are taking it upon themselves to close down their operations, but essential services are still provided. Some tribes, are being impacted from a revenue perspective and unable to fund certain programs. And so it's hard to say exactly what's going on in Indian country because like Tami and Kelbie have mentioned, everything is different across the country depending on where you are. There's jurisdictional challenges, there's lack of services, there's transportation issues, and all of those things are impacted by COVID, right? And I think one of the things that I think is important to mention is that, our helpline, the Strong Hearts Native helpline, when COVID first kind of took storm, we saw a pretty big decrease in the number of calls that we were receiving. And, we attribute that, and, we don't know, data is not available currently, but we attribute that to potentially being isolated with an abusive partner, not having the ability to make that phone call, right? But now since some of the restrictions have been lifted and the stay-at-home orders are being lifted, we're starting to see an uptick in our calls again. And we're actually 200% over our projected call volume, and that's with a few months of decreased number of calls. So we really do think that COVID is impacting, our Native victims and survivors a lot more than we can actually speak to at the moment, right? So we're still kind of looking at the way our data is shifted and what that actually means, and having those conversations with folks in the field to see kind of the impacts now that things are being lifted and and the restrictions are being lifted as well. So I think it's hard to say, but we do know that there is an impact. It's just we're just not quite sure. We just are crossing our fingers and hoping that our folks are going to be okay, and that we'll be able to provide those services as soon as those folks are able to safely reach the services.
I'll just quickly add, Kerri, for a couple of things that, building off of what Liz just mentioned, we know that it's having an impact, but it's hard to kind of pinpoint, exactly what the impact is because the calls have gone down. But we do know that, our tribal shelter programs, and as I said, there's less than 60 for 574 tribes across the U.S. They are really suffering. In particular, some of them have had to close down their shelters because, the virus has gotten very rampant in certain communities. They've had to go to digital services, which is a big hurdle for a lot of Indian country. I can tell you, growing up where I did in southeastern Oklahoma, dial-up was a luxury, and for a lot of people, still, my family still lives back there, the internet is very slow, and sometimes you cannot get a cell signal. So a lot of transitioning services to digital, to digital platforms may work for victims and survivors in other areas of the country, but it really isn't available for tribal citizens who need those particular services. I would be remiss not to mention that there needs to be an influx of funding for domestic violence and sexual assault services, and particularly funding for tribal programs. Tribal programs and tribal nations in particular have been really stonewalled out of accessing billions of dollars that have gone to the Federal Emergency Management Agency for emergency disaster funding for COVID-19, because there's billions of dollars there. But there are only 43 tribes that are directly working with FEMA today to access those resources. So that's about 7% of tribes, and I can tell you if there are only 7% of states that can access billions of dollars, from the federal government to address COVID-19, we would see a riot in Congress. And that's not what's happening. And so tribal nations are being kept from streams that are already available, and the reason they're being kept from it is a lot of tribal nations have not been able to receive the consistent funding out of Homeland Security and from FEMA to build their emergency management programs to be able to access, because you have to have an emergency manager that knows the process, and a lot of these tribes don't. And what they could be doing with these emergency management funds are, making sure that there are spaces safe for Native women in particular. It's, you have to clean, you have to have PPE, you have to make sure that tribal shelter employees are safe and to be able to do this type of work. And there's just a big lack of resources for Indian country. I will say, the most recent CARES Act did have a large amount of funding for Indian country in general, and that covers several different programs for tribal nations that are very much suffering under COVID-19. But what we have done as tribal organizations and as tribal people is say, hey, COVID-19 impacts everybody, but especially, domestic violence, sexual assault victims, they need to have funding specific to their programs and their needs. And so we have worked with the Senate to push forward for a lot of funding. And I will say I believe there was a Senate letter in April that went out asking for $100 million for tribal domestic violence programs addressing COVID-19. And we'll see how the negotiations come out. But, at the end of the day, we know it's hitting Indian country really hard. We know that we're hearing silence from victims, whereas we usually don't. And I know that the calls to Strong Hearts Native Helpline are starting to pick up, but we need to make sure that, our victims and survivors are not lost during this time and that we get them the support they need.
And of course, just like everywhere else, we have definitely seen a change in how victims are being served. We already had a lack of resources, particularly with our isolation in our villages. One of the things that did happen is access to being able to get in and out of villages. We lost to major airlines that basically serviced 189 villages in Alaska, which were only serviced by airplanes. So they can't get to shelter. Even if there was a shelter available, there is not shelter available in most of our communities, no law enforcement, and et cetera. And it's just exacerbated the problem, and it's just made it worse. And we are hearing many stories, and there's a lot of people that are really struggling just to find safe space. And I think that once we get on the other side of this, hopefully, God willing, I suppose, is that we are going to see some of the results of that. And I think it's not going to be good.
Thank you. And I will, in our follow-up email, I will send out our joint statement for Domestic Violence Awareness Month that actually talks about the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, which currently remains unauthorized, and would provide some of these critically needed funding streams for tribal domestic violence shelters. So I'll send that along for everyone to see as well. So, we're almost at time here. I had like one short question, which is just a lot of people, and this is from Jasmine in Montana, and she says a lot of people think that these issues are just a tribal thing. So how do they use their platforms to show, she wants to know how we show that non-natives are involved in this problem and the solution. And so just a little bit more about how they can be better allies, if anyone has any response to that.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer, right? I think one of the biggest challenges we have as Native people is that we continue to be invisible. And that's something that we're working on, raising our visibility. We contribute to every community. It's not just we contribute within our reservation communities. We grow economies. We contribute to the community outside of the reservation boundaries. So I think it's important to educate people on the important contributions that Native citizens across the country make every single day, and how that impacts their livelihoods too. So I think it's one of those things that, we're human too, and we're people, and it's a simple human nature thing to care about your neighbors. And I think that's one of the things that I like to talk about in terms of visibility.
Thanks, Liz.
Liz is so right about visibility. I mean, my favorite thing to do, and I didn't get to do it today, but my favorite thing to do is to introduce myself in my tribal language, because usually people around me start freaking out because they don't expect they don't expect me to start, they don't know what the language is. But visibility is so important. I think when you're having these conversations about, domestic violence, rape, sexual assault in your communities, when I went to law school, we always talked about, like, there's the law, and then there's like the Indian law twist, and there's always these big issues, and there's always an Indian law twist, and making sure that you talk about Native people, when you're discussing these issues. And, as Kerri pointed out, there are a large amount of non-Native that are actually perpetrating the violence. Then part of the way to solve that is to better educate, quite frankly, young men. There's always this conversation of, like, tell young girls, like, dress better, walk with your friends at night, have a whistle. It's like, okay, these are important conversations that I've taken as a woman, but also, like, let's have a conversation with our young men about not rape, and, like, what's consent, and making sure that there are healthy relationships. So I think, making sure to learn more about Native people, talk about us, because we are invisible a lot of times. We fall, sometimes, like me, fly under the radar. It's important to make sure that we're included in the conversation, that the conversation is had, and the conversation also revolves around not just protecting Native women, but also holding, men accountable for their actions, and training men and young boys to talk about these really important issues. So I think that that's another way that people can be better allies as well.
Thank you so much, Kelbie. And so we are at 2:00. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for the second installment of our Domestic Violence Awareness Month series. I hope you can join us next week, next Wednesday, for our next installment. And thank you to all of our panelists for joining. I'm so grateful and so proud to work alongside Liz and Kelbie and Tami. I think creating spaces like this is so important. So I really thank you for joining us, and thank you for the work that you do for Indigenous communities. So Ganesh Chish, thank you.
Thank you.